At 85, I thought I had seen every shade of human cruelty. I was wrong. The worst betrayal came wrapped in the faces I had loved most, delivered with smiles I had trusted for decades, and served on the dinner table where I had fed dreams and ambitions for over half a century. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and this is the story of how I discovered that the family I had sacrificed everything for had been systematically erasing me from their lives, one lie at a time. But more importantly, this is the story of how I made sure they would never forget the woman they tried so hard to forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first crack in my carefully constructed world appeared on a Tuesday morning in October, during what should have been one of the happiest moments of my year. I had been planning this trip to see my family in California for months, coordinating with my daughter Sarah's schedule, making sure I wouldn't interfere with her busy life as a corporate lawyer, and confirming dates with my son Michael's family so I could finally meet my newest great-grandchild. The excitement had been building in my chest like champagne bubbles for weeks. At my age, every family gathering feels precious. Every hug from a grandchild could be the last one they remember of their grandmother. I had spent the previous month preparing, shopping for gifts, having my hair done, even buying a new dress because Sarah had mentioned how important it was to look presentable for family photos. The flight from Boston to Los Angeles was grueling for someone my age, but I endured it with the patience that comes from 8 decades of life. My arthritic hands gripped the armrest during turbulence, my back ached from the cramped seating, and my hearing aids whistled every time I adjusted them. But none of that mattered, because I was going home to my children. When I finally arrived at LAX, wheeling my carefully packed suitcase behind me, I felt that familiar flutter of anticipation in my stomach. I had called Sarah from the gate to let her know I had landed safely, just as she had instructed me to do. Her voice had sounded strained, distracted, but I attributed it to her demanding work schedule. My daughter had always been driven, ambitious to a fault, sometimes forgetting that relationships required the same attention she gave to her legal briefs. The taxi ride to Sarah's house in Beverly Hills took 45 minutes through Los Angeles traffic that made Boston rush hour look like a leisurely Sunday drive. I watched the palm trees blur past the window and tried to imagine how much my youngest grandson had grown since last Christmas. Children change so quickly at that age, and I had missed his birthday in July because Sarah said it would be too much stress for everyone if I traveled during the summer. As we pulled into the circular driveway of Sarah's Mediterranean-style mansion, I felt a surge of pride mixed with something I couldn't quite name. My children had done well for themselves, far better than I had ever dared to dream when I was raising them as a single mother after their father died. Sarah's house was worth more than I had earned in my entire career as a high school English teacher, and Michael's tech company had made him wealthy beyond anything our blue-collar family had ever imagined. I paid the taxi driver with bills I had counted out carefully from my fixed-income budget, and slowly made my way to the front door. The October afternoon sun felt warm on my face, a pleasant change from the crisp New England autumn I had left behind. I pressed the doorbell and waited, adjusting my new dress and patting my hair into place. The door opened, and instead of Sarah's welcoming embrace, I was met with a look of confusion that cut through me like a physical blow. My daughter stood in the doorway wearing workout clothes, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face bore an expression I had never seen directed at me before. Irritation mixed with something that looked almost like panic. "Mom," she said, and even that single word carried a tone that made my stomach drop. "What are you doing here?" The question hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. I felt my carefully planned words stick in my throat as I processed what she had just asked me. What was I doing here? I was visiting my daughter, just as we had planned. I was here because she had invited me, because she had said how much she missed me, because she had promised that this time would be different from all the other visits that had been canceled or postponed or cut short. "I'm here for my visit," I managed to say, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. "We arranged this months ago, sweetheart. You said October would be perfect because your work schedule was lighter." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions that I watched with growing horror. First confusion, then what looked like realization. then something that resembled guilt, and finally a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Mom," she said, stepping back to let me into the house. "I'm so sorry. We completely forgot you were coming today." Forgot. The word echoed in my mind as I wheeled my suitcase into the marble foyer. How do you forget that your 85-year-old mother is flying across the country to see you? How do you forget months of planning, phone calls, the excitement in an elderly woman's voice when she talks about seeing her family? The house felt different than it had during my last visit, colder somehow, despite the warm California weather. The family photos that had lined the hallway seemed to have been rearranged, and I noticed with a sharp pang that several pictures that had included me were no longer visible. The large family portrait from last Christmas, where I had been seated in the center surrounded by children and grandchildren, had been replaced with a smaller one that seemed to have been cropped to exclude me entirely. "Where is everyone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was hoping to see the kids." Sarah's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "The kids are at soccer practice, and David is at the office. It's a Tuesday, Mom. Everyone has their normal routines." Normal routines. As if my visit was so insignificant that it wouldn't warrant any adjustment to normal routines. As if seeing their grandmother was just another item on a to-do list that could be shuffled around or forgotten entirely. "I can wait," I said, settling into one of the white leather chairs in her pristine living room. "I'd love to see them when they get home. And maybe we could have dinner together? I brought some of those cookies you used to love when you were little." The forced smile wavered on Sarah's face. "Actually, Mom, we're on a diet now. The whole family. We're doing this clean eating thing, and we can't really have cookies or anything like that in the house." Clean eating. I stared at my daughter, this successful woman in her designer workout clothes, living in her $1 million house, and I saw a stranger. When had she become someone who would lie so casually to her mother? When had I become someone whose homemade cookies were unwelcome in her home? "I see," I said quietly, and I did see. I was beginning to see quite clearly. The afternoon stretched ahead of us with the awkwardness of two people who had once known each other intimately, but now struggled to find common ground. Sarah made coffee in her gleaming kitchen, apologizing again for the confusion about my visit, explaining how busy everyone had been, how hard it was to keep track of everything with the kids' schedules and David's work demands. I listened and nodded and made appropriate responses, but inside I was cataloging details. The way she kept checking her phone, the way she seemed to be waiting for something, the way she avoided direct eye contact when she spoke about the family's schedule. When David came home that evening, his reaction was almost identical to Sarah's. A moment of confusion, a flash of what looked like annoyance, and then an overly bright smile that felt like a slap. "Eleanor, what a surprise," he said, and the word surprise carried a weight that made it clear this was not a pleasant one. The children's reaction was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. My grandchildren, whom I had watched grow up through carefully curated Facebook photos and brief video calls, looked at me with polite confusion. 12-year-old Emma gave me a perfunctory hug and immediately asked if she could go to her room to finish homework. 9-year-old Tyler barely looked up from his tablet to acknowledge my presence. Dinner was a stilted affair of awkward conversation and long silences. I tried to ask about school, about friends, about the things that grandmothers are supposed to know about their grandchildren's lives. The responses were monosyllabic at best. Sarah kept trying to fill the silence with forced cheerfulness, asking me about my flight, about Boston, about anything except how long I was planning to stay. That night, lying in the guest room that felt more like a hotel room than a place where families stayed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't the warm family reunion I had envisioned. This wasn't the loving homecoming I had spent months anticipating. This was something else entirely, something that made my chest tight with a fear I couldn't quite name. The next morning brought clarity in the cruelest possible way. I woke early, as elderly people tend to do, and made my way quietly to the kitchen to make coffee. The house was still silent, wrapped in that pre-dawn hush that makes every sound seem amplified. I moved carefully, not wanting to wake anyone, grateful for a few moments of solitude to process the strange reception I had received. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I heard voices coming from Sarah's home office down the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear her talking on the phone.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Professional instinct from decades of teaching made me naturally tune in to conversations, a habit that had served me well in managing teenage students, but now revealed something I wished I had never heard. I know, Sarah was saying, her voice carrying that exasperated tone I remembered from her teenage years. She just showed up yesterday. We completely forgot she was coming. There was a pause, presumably while the person on the other end responded. No, David's freaking out because his parents are coming next weekend for their anniversary celebration, and we can't have her here at the same time. You know how his mother feels about my family. Another pause, longer this time. I don't know how long she's planning to stay. We never actually confirmed dates because, honestly, we were hoping she'd forget about the whole thing. She's been talking about this visit for months, but we thought maybe if we didn't bring it up again, she'd just let it go. The coffee maker finished brewing with a soft beep that sounded as loud as a fire alarm in the quiet house. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my arthritic hands trembling slightly as I processed what I had just heard. They had been hoping I would forget. They had been hoping their 85-year-old mother would simply let go of the idea of seeing her family. Look, Michael, Sarah continued, and now I knew who was on the other end of the call. My son, my firstborn, the child I had worked 3 jobs to put through college. You and Jennifer need to back me up on this. We can't keep doing these long visits. It's too disruptive for the kids, and honestly, it's becoming a burden. A burden? I was a burden to my children. I'm thinking we tell her that this weekend isn't good because of David's parents, and maybe suggest she come back for Christmas instead. But just for a couple of days, not the week-long thing she usually wants to do. I heard Michael's voice faintly through the phone, though I couldn't make out the words. Exactly. Sarah agreed with whatever he had said. And Jennifer agrees with us. She was saying just last week how exhausting it is when elderly parents expect their adult children to drop everything for them. We have our own lives, our own families to think about. The conversation continued, but I had heard enough. I quietly poured my coffee and made my way back to the guest room, my mind reeling with this new information. Everything suddenly made sense. The forgotten visit, the awkward reception, the children's indifference, the way Sarah kept checking her phone as if waiting for rescue. I was not welcome in my daughter's home. I was not a beloved grandmother coming for a cherished visit. I was an inconvenience, a disruption, a burden that needed to be managed and minimized. But as I sat in that impersonal guest room, sipping coffee that tasted bitter despite the cream I had added, I felt something stirring inside me that I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't hurt, though that was certainly there. It wasn't disappointment, though that threatened to overwhelm me. It was something sharper, more focused. It was anger. Pure, clean, clarifying anger at the realization that the children I had sacrificed everything for had been systematically writing me out of their lives. That the family I had built with my own hands, supported with my own labor, and loved with my whole heart, had decided I was no longer worth their time or consideration. I had spent the last 20 years of my life being accommodating, understanding, flexible. I had canceled plans when they needed to reschedule. I had shortened visits when they claimed to be too busy. I had accepted phone calls instead of visits, emails instead of phone calls, and eventually silence instead of emails. All because I didn't want to be a burden to my successful, busy children. Well, I thought as I finished my coffee and began to plan, if they thought I was a burden before, they had no idea what was coming. The morning passed quietly as I observed my daughter's household from my new perspective. I watched Sarah carefully orchestrate a busy schedule that seemed designed to minimize any time we might spend together. She had a client meeting that couldn't be moved, followed by a lunch that was absolutely crucial, and then she needed to pick up the kids early because of some scheduling conflict with their usual after-school routine. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she said, and the apology sounded as rehearsed as a closing argument. "I know you came all this way to spend time with us, but this week turned out to be incredibly hectic. Maybe we should have planned this better. As if I hadn't called 3 months ago to coordinate dates. as if I hadn't sent confirmation emails, as if I hadn't arranged my own limited schedule around her convenience. "That's quite all right, dear," I said with a smile that felt foreign on my face. "I understand how busy you are. Your career has always been your priority." Something in my tone must have registered because Sarah paused in her rush to gather papers and car keys, looking at me with a flicker of uncertainty. "It's not that you're not a priority, Mom. It's just that I'm a burden," I finished for her, watching her face carefully. "That my visits are disruptive. That it would be better if I forgot about spending time with my family altogether." The color drained from Sarah's face so quickly that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Mom, I don't know what you—" "Your office door was open this morning when you were talking to Michael," I said quietly. Sound carries in these modern houses with their open floor plans. Sarah's mouth opened and closed without any words coming out, like a fish gasping for air. I had seen that same expression on her face when she was 7 years old, and I had caught her in a lie about breaking my favorite vase. "I can explain," she finally managed. "Oh, I'm sure you can," I replied, standing up from the kitchen stool where I had been sitting. "You're a lawyer, after all. Explaining things is what you do for a living. But I don't think I'm interested in hearing your explanation right now." I walked past her toward the guest room, my steps measured and deliberate, despite the arthritis that made each movement painful. "Mom, wait," Sarah called after me. "Let's talk about this. Let's figure out how to make this work." I turned back to look at her, this stranger wearing my daughter's face, and felt something settle into place inside me. A decision crystallizing, a plan beginning to form. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, and my voice was probably the calmest it had been since I arrived. "We're definitely going to figure out how to make this work, just not in the way you think." That afternoon, while Sarah was at her supposedly urgent client meeting, I made a phone call that would change everything. I called my son Michael in San Francisco, using the same tone I had perfected during 40 years of teaching difficult students. "Hello, Michael," I said when he answered. "I think it's time we had a conversation about my visit to California." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him calculating how much Sarah might have told him about our morning confrontation. "Hi, Mom," he said carefully. "Sarah mentioned you were feeling a little upset about the scheduling confusion." Scheduling confusion. What a delicate way to describe being forgotten and dismissed. "Is that what she called it?" I asked. "How interesting." I had a different impression of our conversation this morning. Another pause. Longer this time. "Look, Mom, I know this visit didn't start off the way you expected, but maybe we can figure out a way to make the rest of your time here more enjoyable." "Oh, I intend to make it very enjoyable indeed," I said. "In fact, I was hoping you and Jennifer might be free for dinner tonight. I have some things I'd like to discuss with the whole family." "Tonight?" Michael's voice carried that same strain I had heard in Sarah's. "That's really short notice, Mom. Jennifer has her book club, and the kids have activities." "Cancel them," I said, and the authority in my voice surprised even me. "This is important, Michael. More important than book clubs or activities or whatever other excuses you and your sister have been using to avoid spending time with your mother." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been dropped. "Mom," Michael finally said, and his voice was very quiet. "What exactly did you hear this morning?" "Everything," I replied. "Absolutely everything. And now I'm very interested to hear what you and Jennifer think about elderly parents who expect their adult children to drop everything for them." I believe those were the words Sarah used when she was quoting your wife. I heard him curse softly under his breath. "I'll call Jennifer," he said. "We'll be there at 7. "Wonderful," I said sweetly. "I'm so looking forward to it." After I hung up, I sat in the guest room and allowed myself a moment to feel the full weight of what I had discovered. My children, the two people I had loved more than my own life, had been discussing me like a problem to be solved. They had been coordinating strategies to minimize my presence in their lives. They had been treating their mother like an unwelcome obligation rather than a cherished family member. But as I sat there in that sterile guest room, surrounded by the evidence of my daughter's success, I realized something that probably should have frightened me but instead filled me with a strange sense of purpose. I wasn't just hurt. I wasn't just disappointed. I was strategically, methodically, comprehensively angry. And at 85 years old, with nothing left to lose and a lifetime of experience in handling difficult people, I was about to become the most challenging problem my children had ever faced. The family dinner that evening was a masterpiece of forced civility, layered over barely contained tension. Jennifer arrived with the sort of smile that well-bred women perfect for social occasions, the kind that never reaches the eyes. Michael looked like a man preparing for an execution. Sarah had clearly spent the afternoon coaching David and the children on how to behave, because everyone was suddenly very interested in asking me about Boston and my flight and how I was enjoying California. We sat around Sarah's elegant dining room table, using the good china that I had given her as a wedding gift 15 years ago, and played the roles of a loving family gathering. The children asked polite questions about my life. David complimented my dress. Jennifer inquired about my health with the practiced concern of someone who hoped the answer would be brief. I played along beautifully, answering their questions with grandmother warmth, asking about school and work and all the normal things that normal families discuss over dinner. I complimented Sarah on the meal, even though I could tell it had been catered. I admired Jennifer's earrings and asked about her book club. But underneath the pleasant conversation, I was watching and cataloging and planning. I noticed how Michael and Sarah exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I observed the way Jennifer kept checking her watch. I saw how the children seemed coached in their responses, as if they had been given a script for interacting with their grandmother. It wasn't until we had finished the main course and Sarah was clearing plates that I decided it was time to begin. "This has been such a lovely evening," I said, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet dining room. "It reminds me of all those family dinners we used to have when you children were young. Do you remember, Sarah, Michael? How we would sit around our little kitchen table in that apartment on Maple Street and talk about our days." Both of my children nodded, uncertain where this was leading. "Of course, we didn't have help then," I continued. "I worked 3 jobs to keep food on that table and a roof over our heads after your father died. But we always made time for family dinner. No matter how tired I was, no matter how many hours I had put in at the diner or the department store or tutoring students in the evenings, we always had that time together." Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her chair. David found something fascinating about his wine glass. The children had gone very still in the way that children do when they sense adult tension they don't understand. "I sacrificed a lot during those years," I said, my tone still conversational, still warm. "I gave up opportunities for advancement because they would have required travel that took me away from you. I turned down a chance to go back to school for my master's degree because we couldn't afford both tuition and rent. I never remarried, even though there were opportunities, because I wanted to focus all my energy on raising my children to be successful, caring adults." Sarah had stopped clearing plates and was standing frozen by the sideboard, a stack of china in her hands. "And I'm so proud of what you've both accomplished," I continued. "Sarah, you've built an incredible career in law. Michael, your technology company is thriving. You've both created beautiful families, achieved financial success beyond anything I ever dreamed possible when I was reading bedtime stories in that tiny apartment." "Mom," Michael started, but I held up a gentle hand to stop him. "I'm not finished, dear," I said. "You see, I've been thinking a lot today about family and obligations and what we owe each other. It's interesting how perspectives change depending on where you're sitting." I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "This morning I overheard Sarah talking to you, Michael, about how exhausting it is when elderly parents expect their adult children to drop everything for them. About how my visits are becoming a burden. About how you were all hoping I would simply forget about wanting to spend time with my family." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the antique clock ticking in the hallway. "And I realized," I said, my voice still pleasant, still conversational, "that you're absolutely right. It is exhausting to have family members who expect things from you. It is disruptive when people you're obligated to care about make demands on your time and energy. It is a burden to maintain relationships that don't provide you with immediate benefit. Jennifer's face had gone pale. Sarah was still holding the stack of plates as if she had forgotten they were there. "So I've made a decision," I announced. And now there was steel in my voice beneath the grandmother's sweetness. "I'm going to stop being a burden to my children, but I'm going to do it in my own way, on my own terms." "What does that mean?" David asked, and I could hear the lawyer in him, already trying to assess potential legal ramifications. I smiled at him, the kind of smile that had once made difficult students reconsider their behavior choices. "It means, David, that this family is about to learn what it really feels like when someone stops making an effort. When someone stops being accommodating and understanding and flexible. When someone decides to protect their own interests with the same enthusiasm that you've all been protecting yours." I stood up from the table, my movements deliberate despite the arthritis that made everything ache. "You see, children," I said, and there was something in my voice that made both Sarah and Michael instinctively straighten in their chairs. A tone they remembered from childhood discipline. "You've made the mistake of thinking that because I'm old, I'm also powerless. You've assumed that because I love you, I'll continue to accept whatever scraps of attention you choose to throw my way." I walked around the table, my hand trailing along the back of each chair as I passed. But love doesn't mean accepting disrespect, and being a mother doesn't mean being a doormat. And at 85 years old, I've learned that sometimes the people who deserve your energy the least are the ones who demand it the most. I paused behind Sarah's chair, and she turned to look up at me with an expression that was part confusion, part fear, and part something that might have been recognition. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, and my voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 4 decades managing classrooms full of teenagers. "You wanted me to stop being a burden? Congratulations. You're about to get exactly what you asked for." The next morning, I began what I privately called Phase 1 of my education plan. Because that's what this was, really, an education for my children, about the consequences of their choices and the value of what they had been taking for granted. I started by doing exactly what they had apparently wanted me to do. I stopped being accommodating. When Sarah knocked on the guest room door at 8 in the morning, clearly intending to have some sort of damage control conversation about the previous evening, I simply didn't answer. I had heard her footsteps in the hallway, heard her pause outside the door, heard the soft knock and the whispered, "Mom?" But I lay in bed reading a book I had brought from home, as calm and unmoved as if she didn't exist. She knocked again, more insistently this time, and called my name a little louder. Still nothing from me. I turned a page in my book and continued reading as if the most interesting thing in the world was happening in the story, rather than in the hallway outside my door. After 5 minutes of intermittent knocking and calling, I heard her footsteps retreat. 20 minutes later, they returned, accompanied by heavier steps that I recognized as David's. "Eleanor?" David called through the door. "Are you okay in there? Sarah's concerned because you're not answering." I smiled at the book in my hands. "Concerned? How touching. Mom, please." Sarah's voice was closer to the door now, and I could hear something that might have been genuine worry creeping into her tone. "We need to talk about last night." I think there was some misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Another delicate euphemism for what had actually happened. They tried for another 10 minutes, their voices growing increasingly strained. David suggested maybe I was sick and they should call a doctor. Sarah wondered aloud if I had somehow left the house without them knowing. I heard them whispering to each other about whether they should call the police or try to get into the room somehow. Finally, I decided I had made my point and called out in my most pleasant voice. "Good morning. I'm fine. Thank you for asking. I'm just reading and enjoying some quiet time." The relief in Sarah's voice was palpable. "Mom, we've been trying to talk to you for 20 minutes. Why didn't you answer?" "Oh," I said, still speaking through the closed door. "I thought you might want some space this morning. You mentioned yesterday how disruptive my presence can be, so I decided to be less disruptive by staying in my room." There was a long pause. "Can we please talk?" Sarah asked. "Face to face?" "I don't think so," I replied cheerfully. "I'm quite comfortable in here, and I wouldn't want to burden you with my company when you have so many important things to do." I heard them whispering again, more urgently this time. "Mom," David called out, "we're going to be late for work if we don't leave soon. The kids need to get to school." "Oh, please don't let me keep you," I called back. "I know how important your normal routines are. Far more important than accommodating unexpected guests." More whispering, and then Sarah's voice, tighter now. "What do you want, Mom?" What did I want? The question hung in the air, and I considered how to answer it. What I wanted was for the last 24 hours to be a nightmare that I could wake up from. What I wanted was for my children to actually want me in their lives. What I wanted was to feel like a beloved mother and grandmother instead of an unwelcome obligation. But what I said was, "I want exactly what you want, dear. I want to stop being a burden to your family." "That's not," Sarah started, but I cut her off. "Have a wonderful day at work," I called out sweetly. "Don't worry about me at all. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." I heard them leave 20 minutes later, and the house settled into the kind of quiet that comes with being completely alone. I got dressed slowly, made myself breakfast in Sarah's pristine kitchen, and then did something I hadn't done in years. I made myself completely at home in someone else's house. I started with the family photos. I spent the morning methodically examining every family photograph in Sarah's house, and what I discovered was even more damning than I had expected. It wasn't just that recent photos had been arranged to minimize my presence. It was a systematic erasure that had been happening for years, so gradually that I hadn't noticed it during my brief, carefully managed visits. The large family portrait from 2 Christmases ago, where I had been seated prominently in the center surrounded by grandchildren, had been replaced with a cropped version that showed only Sarah's immediate family. The photo from Michael's graduation from business school, where I stood proudly beside him in my best dress, had been swapped for one taken moments later when I had stepped aside to let Jennifer join the shot. Most telling of all was the formal family tree display in Sarah's home office, a beautiful piece of calligraphy work that traced the family lineage. It showed David's parents in elegant script, included his grandparents and great-grandparents. But my side of the family tree simply stopped at Sarah and Michael's names. No mention of their mother, no acknowledgement of the woman who had raised them single-handedly after their father's death. I had been systematically edited out of my own family's history. Standing in that office, holding a magnifying glass I'd found in Sarah's desk drawer to better examine the family tree, I felt something shift inside me that went deeper than anger. This wasn't just neglect or thoughtlessness. This was deliberate, calculated removal of my existence from their narrative. They weren't just hoping I would become less of a burden. They were actively working to pretend I had never been a significant part of their lives. I photographed everything with the smartphone that Michael had insisted I learn to use 2 years ago, back when he still pretended to care about staying in touch with me. Every cropped photo, every rearranged display, every piece of evidence that showed how thoroughly they had been erasing me. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using the technology he had taught me to document his betrayal. By the time Sarah returned home that evening, I had compiled quite a collection of evidence, but more importantly, I had formulated a plan that would have made my most strategic students proud. If my children wanted to play games with family relationships, they were about to learn that their old mother had been managing difficult personalities for far longer than they had been alive. Sarah found me in the living room, calmly reading a book with a cup of tea beside me, looking for all the world like a content grandmother enjoying a peaceful afternoon. "Mom," she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "I was worried when you wouldn't talk to us this morning." I looked up from my book with a pleasant smile. "Oh, hello, dear. Did you have a good day at work?" The normalcy of my tone seemed to throw her off balance. She had clearly spent the day preparing for another confrontation, perhaps even consulting with colleagues about how to handle difficult elderly relatives. My calm demeanor wasn't what she had expected. "It was fine," she said cautiously. "Mom, about this morning, and about last night at dinner. I think we need to clear the air." "Clear the air about what?" I asked, tilting my head slightly in a gesture of innocent confusion that I had perfected during decades of dealing with students who thought they could manipulate me. Sarah's carefully prepared speech seemed to evaporate. About what you overheard yesterday. About the things I said to Michael." "Oh, that," I said, waving a dismissive hand. "Don't worry about it, sweetheart. I understand completely." This was clearly not the response she had anticipated. I watched her struggle to recalibrate, like a lawyer whose opening argument had just been rendered irrelevant by an unexpected confession from the opposing side. "You understand?" she repeated. "Of course I do," I said warmly. "You're busy people with demanding lives. Having an elderly mother around is disruptive to your routine. It's perfectly natural that you would want to minimize that disruption." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions as she tried to determine whether this was genuine acceptance or some kind of trap. In her professional life, she was probably accustomed to adversaries who telegraphed their moves, who showed their anger openly, who could be predicted and countered. She had no framework for dealing with someone who appeared to be agreeing with her, while simultaneously making her feel like she was standing on quicksand. "I wouldn't say we want to minimize anything," she said carefully. "It's just the coordinating schedules can be challenging." "Absolutely," I agreed. "Which is why I've decided to make things much easier for everyone." Now she looked genuinely worried. "What do you mean?" I closed my book and gave her my full attention, the way I used to do with students who were about to receive important instructions. "Well, I've been thinking about what you said about elderly parents who expect their adult children to drop everything for them. You're quite right that it's an unfair expectation." Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but I continued before she could interrupt. "So I've decided that from now on, I won't expect anything from you or Michael. No more coordinated visits, no more requests for your time, no more disruptions to your normal routines. I'm going to be completely self-sufficient." "Mom, that's not..." "In fact," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt, "I think it would be best if I handled all my own affairs from now on. Medical appointments, legal matters, financial decisions. I wouldn't want to burden you with any of those responsibilities when the time comes." The color began to drain from Sarah's face as the implications of what I was saying started to sink in. As a lawyer, she understood better than most what those responsibilities typically entailed, and more importantly, what they were worth financially. "There's no need to make such drastic changes," she said quickly. "We can figure out a better way to handle visits." "Oh, but I insist," I said cheerfully. "You've opened my eyes to how selfish I've been, expecting my children to accommodate their mother's wishes. It's time I started acting like the independent woman I raised you to be." I walked past her toward the kitchen, then turned back as if I had just remembered something. "Oh, and Sarah?" I noticed some inconsistencies in the family photos around the house. Some of them seemed to have been cropped or replaced. "I'm sure it was just an oversight, but I thought you should know that I've documented everything for insurance purposes. You know how important proper documentation is in legal matters." The way she froze told me that she knew exactly which photos I was talking about, and that the cropping hadn't been accidental. But instead of acknowledging it, she tried a different approach. "Mom, I think you're overreacting to a private conversation that you took out of context. Michael and I love you. We want you in our lives." "I'm sure you do," I said, and my tone was so pleasant that it took her a moment to process the words. "Just not very much. And not very often, and preferably not in any way that inconveniences you." That evening, David came home to find his wife pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, muttering to herself about legal strategies and damage control. I was in the guest room, making phone calls and arrangements with the sort of efficiency that comes from years of managing complex schedules and difficult people. My first call was to my financial advisor in Boston, a sharp young woman named Patricia, who had been handling my investments for the past decade. What most people didn't realize was that my late husband's life insurance policy, combined with 40 years of careful saving and smart investing, had left me considerably more comfortable than my children assumed. I had never flaunted my financial security, preferring to live modestly and let them believe that their success far exceeded my own. "Patricia," I said when she answered, "I need to make some changes to my estate planning." "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. What kind of changes are you considering?" "I want to revoke the power of attorney I granted to my daughter and establish a new trust structure, one that doesn't include my children as primary beneficiaries." There was a pause, and I could almost hear Patricia's professional wheels turning. She had met Sarah and Michael during previous meetings, and had probably assumed they would inherit everything eventually. That's certainly your prerogative, she said carefully. May I ask, what's prompting this decision? Let's just say I've had some revelations about family loyalty that have caused me to reconsider my priorities, I replied. I'd like to set up appointments to discuss charitable giving options and alternative legacy planning strategies. I can arrange that. Would you like me to recommend some reputable charitable organizations that align with your interests? Actually, I have some specific ideas in mind. I'm particularly interested in scholarships for single mothers pursuing education and programs that support elderly individuals who have been abandoned by their families. Patricia's voice took on a note of genuine respect. Those are excellent causes, Mrs. Whitmore. I think we can structure something very meaningful. My second call was to my physician in Boston, Dr. Martinez, who had been caring for me for 15 years and knew my medical history better than anyone. Elena, I said, using the informal name she had invited me to call her years ago, I need to establish care with a new doctor here in California. Can you recommend someone who specializes in geriatric medicine and has experience with complex family dynamics? Of course, Eleanor. But may I ask why you're looking for care in California? Are you relocating? I'm considering extending my stay here indefinitely, I said. My children have made it clear that they prefer to have me close by, and I want to accommodate their wishes. What I didn't tell Dr. Martinez was that I had no intention of actually staying in California permanently. But I wanted my children to believe that I might, to worry about what that would mean for their carefully arranged lives, to understand that their mother wasn't as predictable and manageable as they had assumed. My third call was to Michael, and this conversation proved to be even more illuminating than my morning discovery of the edited photographs. Hi, Mom, he said when he answered, and I could hear children's voices in the background. Sarah called me about your conversation today. She's concerned that you're upset about something. Upset? I said, injecting just a note of surprise into my voice. Why would I be upset? I'm grateful to you and your sister for helping me see things more clearly. What things? Well, you were both absolutely right about elderly parents becoming burdens on their adult children. I've been selfish, expecting you to adjust your lives to accommodate my needs. It's time I became more independent. There was a long pause, and when Michael spoke again, his voice had a cautious quality that reminded me of how he used to sound when he was a child, trying to gauge whether he was in trouble. Mom, nobody said you were a burden. Didn't they? I asked. I distinctly remember Sarah quoting your wife Jennifer about how exhausting it is when elderly parents expect their adult children to drop everything for them. Were those not Jennifer's words? Another pause, longer this time. In the background, I could hear Jennifer's voice asking who was on the phone, followed by what sounded like a quickly whispered explanation. Look, Mom, sometimes when people are stressed, they say things they don't really mean. Family dynamics can be complicated. Oh, I completely agree, I said. Family dynamics are very complicated indeed, which is why I've decided to simplify things considerably. What do you mean by that? I mean that I'm going to stop complicating your family dynamics. I'm going to become the kind of mother who doesn't expect anything from her children, the kind who doesn't disrupt their routines or burden them with her needs or inconvenience them with her presence. Mom, you're not. Michael, I interrupted, and there was enough authority in my voice to stop him mid-sentence. I raised you to be honest and direct. So I'm going to be honest and direct with you. I know that you and Sarah have been coordinating strategies to minimize my presence in your lives. I know that you've been hoping I would simply fade into the background and stop expecting to be treated like a valued family member. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I began to wonder if he had hung up. We never wanted you to fade into the background, he finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then explain the family photos in Sarah's house, I said. Explain the family tree in her office that traces David's lineage back 3 generations but stops at your names, as if you sprang into existence without a mother. Explain the careful editing of images to minimize my presence in your family narrative. I heard him curse softly under his breath, a habit he had picked up in college and never quite shaken. Those photos, that wasn't intentional. It was just about wall space and design choices. Michael, I said, and my voice carried the same tone I had used when he was 12 and trying to convince me that his homework had been eaten by the dog. I taught high school English for 40 years. I can spot a poorly constructed lie from 3 time zones away. Another long pause, and then, "What do you want from us, Mom?" What did I want? The question that kept being asked, as if my motivations were some complex puzzle that needed to be solved. What I wanted was simple and impossible. I wanted my children to love me enough to want me in their lives. I wanted to be treated with the respect and consideration that I had spent their entire lives teaching them to show to others. I wanted to matter to the people I had sacrificed everything for. But what I said was, I want exactly what you and Sarah want. I want to stop being an inconvenience to your families. You're not an inconvenience. Then prove it, I said, and let the challenge hang in the air between us. How? Come to dinner tomorrow night. Bring Jennifer and the children. Cancel whatever plans you have, and prioritize spending time with your mother. Show me that I matter more than book clubs and client meetings and normal routines. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. Tomorrow is really difficult, Michael finally said. Jennifer has that book club meeting, and Tommy has soccer practice, and there it is, I said softly. The truth that you've both been dancing around. I don't matter enough to disrupt your precious routines. Mom, that's not fair. Fair? I said, and now there was steel in my voice. Let me tell you about fair, Michael. Fair would have been including your mother in family photos instead of cropping her out. Fair would have been remembering when she was coming to visit instead of hoping she would forget. Fair would have been treating her like a beloved family member instead of an unwelcome obligation. I heard him take a shaky breath. We can reschedule some things, he said. Maybe we can work something out. Don't bother, I replied. I wouldn't want you to inconvenience yourselves on my account. I'm learning to have much lower expectations of my children. What does that mean? It means, dear, that you and Sarah are about to discover what it feels like when someone stops making an effort. When someone stops being accommodating and understanding and flexible. When someone decides to protect their own interests with the same enthusiasm that you've been protecting yours. I ended the call before he could respond, and spent the next several minutes staring out the guest room window at Sarah's perfectly manicured backyard. The landscaping was beautiful, expensive, and completely sterile, much like the family relationships in this house. That night at dinner, the atmosphere was noticeably different from the previous evening. David and Sarah exchanged frequent glances, and I could tell they had spent the afternoon discussing strategy. The children seemed to have been coached again, because they were making an obvious effort to include me in conversation and show interest in my answers. Grandma Eleanor, Emma said with the kind of forced brightness that indicated adult coaching, tell us about when you were our age. What was school like back then? I smiled at her, genuinely touched by her effort, even though I knew it wasn't entirely her own idea. Well, sweetheart, when I was your age, we didn't have computers or cell phones or any of the technology you use every day. We had to do all our research in the library, using actual books and card catalogs. What's a card catalog? Tyler asked, and his curiosity seemed genuine. It was a system of small drawers filled with cards that told you where to find books in the library, I explained. You had to know the author's name or the subject you were looking for, and then you would search through hundreds of little cards to find the right one. That sounds really hard, Emma said. It was more time-consuming than hard, I replied, but it taught us to be patient and methodical. We had to work harder for information, which meant we appreciated it more when we found it. Sarah was watching this exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read. Relief that the children were engaging with me? Guilt about the conversation I had overheard? Calculation about how to manage this new dynamic. Mom, she said during a lull in the conversation, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about becoming more independent. I want you to know that we don't expect you to handle everything on your own. That's very kind of you to say, I replied, cutting a piece of the salmon that had definitely been catered, despite Sarah's claim that she had cooked it herself. But I think it's time I stopped expecting my children to take care of me. You both have your own families and responsibilities now. David leaned forward slightly. Eleanor, family means helping each other. It's not about keeping score or measuring burdens. I looked at him with interest. That's a lovely sentiment, David. Is that why your parents will be staying here next weekend while I won't be? The question landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of discomfort around the table. Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. David's face went through several color changes. Even the children seemed to sense that something significant had just happened. How did you? Sarah started, then stopped herself. How did I know about your in-laws' visit? I finished for her. You mentioned it yesterday morning during your phone call with Michael. The one where you were discussing how my presence here would be problematic because of how David's mother feels about my family. David set down his wine glass with slightly more force than necessary. My mother doesn't have any problem with your family, doesn't she? I asked mildly. Then perhaps Sarah misunderstood the situation when she told Michael that you couldn't have me here at the same time as your parents. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the children breathing. Emma and Tyler were looking back and forth between the adults, like spectators at a tennis match, trying to follow a game whose rules they didn't understand. Maybe the kids should be excused, Jennifer suggested from across the table, speaking for the first time since we had sat down. Oh, I don't think that's necessary, I said pleasantly. This is an excellent learning opportunity for them. They're seeing a real-time demonstration of family dynamics and how people prioritize relationships. Mom, Sarah said, and there was warning in her voice. What, dear? I'm simply making conversation. Isn't this the kind of honest family discussion that builds character and teaches children about loyalty and respect? David cleared his throat. Perhaps we should talk about this privately later. Why? I asked, tilting my head with innocent curiosity. Are you ashamed of how you've been treating your mother-in-law? Do you think the children shouldn't know that some family members are considered more important than others? That's not what's happening here, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I replied. Let me see if I understand the situation correctly. Your husband's parents are welcome in your home for a celebratory visit. Your mother, who flew across the country to see her family, is an inconvenience who should have been forgotten about entirely. Your in-laws deserve accommodation and hospitality. Your mother deserves to be edited out of family photos and discussed like a problem to be managed. Emma was staring at her mother with wide eyes. Mom, why would you edit Grandma out of photos? And there it was. The question that cut straight to the heart of the matter, asked with the brutal honesty that only children possess. Sarah's face went pale, then red, then pale again as she struggled to find an explanation that wouldn't make her sound like exactly what she was. It wasn't like that, sweetheart, she said, but her voice was strained. Sometimes when you're arranging photos, you have to make choices about space and composition. But why would you choose to take Grandma out instead of someone else? Tyler asked, and his confusion was genuine. She's family too. Out of the mouths of babes. These children, who had been coached to be polite to their grandmother, were instinctively understanding something that their parents had lost sight of. That family means including people, not finding reasons to exclude them. That's enough, David said, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to ending difficult conversations. Eleanor, I think you're misinterpreting some things and creating conflict where none needs to exist. I looked at him with the kind of steady gaze that had once made misbehaving students reconsider their choices. Am I? Then perhaps you can explain why your wife felt the need to call your children and coordinate strategies for managing my visit. Perhaps you can explain why she hoped I would simply forget about wanting to spend time with my family. We never said we wanted you to forget. David, I interrupted, and there was enough steel in my voice to stop him mid-sentence. I heard the entire conversation. I know exactly what was said and what was meant. So please don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. The children were now looking distinctly uncomfortable, sensing adult tension they couldn't fully understand but knowing it was serious. Emma had stopped eating entirely and was gripping her napkin in her lap. Tyler kept glancing between his parents and me as if trying to determine who was winning this verbal battle. Kids, Sarah said, her voice artificially bright, why don't you go upstairs and start your homework? The adults need to have a conversation. Actually, I said before the children could move, I think they should stay. This conversation is about family loyalty and respect, and those are lessons that children need to learn early. Mom, stop, Sarah said, and there was real distress in her voice now. You're scaring the kids. Am I? I looked at Emma and Tyler, both of whom were watching me with expressions of curiosity rather than fear. Are you scared, Emma? The 12-year-old shook her head slowly. No, Grandma, but I'm confused about why Mom and Dad don't want you to visit us. And there it was again, the devastating honesty of a child cutting through all the adult rationalizations and excuses. Sarah's face crumpled slightly, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. We do want Grandma to visit, Sarah said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. Then why did you forget she was coming? Tyler asked. And why did you say we're on a diet when she brought cookies? We ate cookies yesterday after school. The lies were unraveling faster than Sarah could weave new ones. Her children, with their clear-eyed perspective on adult behavior, were exposing the contradictions and deceptions that she had thought were cleverly hidden. Sometimes adults say things they don't mean when they're stressed, David offered, trying to help his wife navigate the minefield that dinner had become. Like when you told Grandma that we forgot she was coming, but you really just didn't want her here? Emma asked with the ruthless logic of adolescence. The silence that followed was devastating. Sarah opened and closed her mouth several times without producing any sound. David stared at his plate as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Jennifer looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. I think, I said into the silence, my voice gentle but implacable. That's exactly what they meant, Emma. Sometimes adults prioritize their own convenience over the feelings of people they're supposed to love. That's not. Sarah started, but I held up a hand to stop her. It's all right, dear, I said. The children are learning an important lesson about how families can work, and how they shouldn't work. They're seeing what happens when people take love for granted and assume that family members will accept whatever treatment they're given. I stood up from the table, my movements deliberate despite the arthritis that made everything ache. Thank you for dinner, I said politely. I think I'll retire to my room now. I have some phone calls to make and arrangements to confirm. What arrangements? Sarah asked, and there was panic creeping into her voice. Oh, just some things I need to take care of, I said vaguely. Insurance matters, legal documents, that sort of thing. The kind of independent decisions that people make when they realize they can't count on their families for support. I walked toward the hallway, then turned back as if I had just remembered something. Oh, and Sarah? I'll be extending my stay here indefinitely. Since you and Michael were so concerned about the burden of my visits, I thought I'd solve that problem by making this visit permanent. I'll be looking for a place of my own in the area so I can be close to my grandchildren without inconveniencing their parents. The look of horror that crossed Sarah's face was worth the months of hurt feelings and disappointment I had endured. The idea of her difficult, unpredictable mother living permanently in her carefully controlled social circle was clearly her worst nightmare come to life. Mom, you can't what? I asked sweetly. Can't make decisions about my own life? Can't choose where to live? Can't prioritize spending time with family members who actually seem to enjoy my company? I gestured toward Emma and Tyler, both of whom had been watching this exchange with fascination. Your children are delightful, Sarah. Much more welcoming than their parents. I'm looking forward to getting to know them better. And with that, I walked calmly out of the dining room, leaving behind a table full of adults who were finally beginning to understand that their elderly mother was not as manageable as they had assumed. As I closed the guest room door behind me, I could hear the urgent whispered conversation that erupted in my wake. Sarah's voice was higher than usual, David's responses were clipped and tense, and I caught fragments about legal options and quote 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 quote. Let them strategize, I thought, as I settled into the uncomfortable chair by the window. They were about to learn that their mother had been managing difficult people in complex situations for far longer than they had been alive, and that underestimating Eleanor Whitmore was a mistake they would not make twice. The next morning brought a flurry of activity that would have been comical if it weren't so revealing of my children's true priorities. I woke to the sound of heated whispered conversations in the hallway outside my room, followed by the unmistakable sounds of Sarah pacing while talking rapidly on her phone. Through the thin walls of her modern house, I could hear fragments of what sounded like legal consultations mixed with frantic calls to Michael. I took my time getting dressed, selecting a particularly elegant outfit that I had brought for what I had originally hoped would be pleasant family dinners. The navy blue dress with its pearl buttons had been my favorite for special occasions, and today felt very special indeed. I was about to teach my children the most important lesson of their adult lives. By the time I emerged from the guest room, Sarah had transformed her kitchen island into what looked like a war room. Legal pads covered with notes, her laptop open to what appeared to be real estate websites, and her phone buzzing constantly with incoming calls. She looked up when I entered, and I was struck by how much she had aged overnight. The stress lines around her eyes were more pronounced, and her usually perfect hair looked like she had been running her fingers through it. "Good morning, dear," I said pleasantly, moving to the coffee maker with the familiarity of someone who had every right to be there. "You're up early. I hope my announcement last night didn't disrupt your sleep." Sarah's laugh had a slightly hysterical edge to it. "Mom, we need to talk seriously about this idea of yours. Moving to California permanently isn't a decision you can make overnight." "Why not?" I asked, pouring coffee into one of her expensive ceramic mugs. "I'm 85 years old, Sarah. How much time do you think I have left to waste on careful deliberation?" The bluntness of my words seemed to catch her off guard. "That's not what I meant. It's just that there are practical considerations. Housing costs here are astronomical, and you'd need to establish new medical care, and you're worried about what your neighbors and colleagues will think when they meet your difficult elderly mother," I finished for her. "You've spent years carefully controlling my interactions with your social circle, and now you're panicking at the thought of me having unsupervised access to your reputation." Sarah's face flushed, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she tried a different approach. "I'm worried about you, Mom. This isn't like you. Making sudden, dramatic decisions, trying to upend everyone's lives. Maybe you should talk to someone, a counselor or a psychiatrist," I suggested mildly. "Someone who could perhaps declare me mentally incompetent? How convenient that would be for you." The way Sarah's eyes flickered told me that the thought had indeed crossed her mind, probably during one of her late-night strategy sessions with David. "That's not what I meant," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Of course not," I replied. "You're just concerned about my sudden change in behavior. The fact that your normally accommodating mother is suddenly standing up for herself must be very disturbing." I sat down at her kitchen island, directly across from her legal pads and laptops, and smiled at her with the kind of calm confidence that I had once used to manage parent-teacher conferences with hostile parents. "Tell me, Sarah, what exactly did you think would happen when I discovered how you and Michael really felt about me? Did you imagine I would simply accept being treated like an unwelcome burden and continue pretending that everything was fine?" Sarah's phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it reflexively before looking back at me. "Michael's on his way over. We think it would be better if we discussed this as a family." "How lovely," I said. "A family meeting. I can't remember the last time you and your brother coordinated your schedules to spend time with me. Oh, wait, I can. It was never." An hour later, Michael arrived with Jennifer and their children in tow, looking like a man heading to his own execution. The house suddenly felt much smaller with everyone gathered in Sarah's living room, and I noticed how my son kept glancing toward the exits as if planning escape routes. Jennifer had clearly been briefed on the situation because she immediately launched into what sounded like a prepared speech about family harmony and the importance of not making hasty decisions during emotional times. She spoke with the kind of practiced concern that social workers use with difficult clients, and I let her finish before responding. "That's very thoughtful of you, Jennifer," I said when she finally ran out of platitudes. "I'm curious, though, about this sudden concern for family harmony. Where was this concern when you were telling my son how exhausting elderly parents can be?" Jennifer's composure cracked slightly. "I never said you specifically were exhausting." "No, you said elderly parents in general were exhausting when they expect their adult children to drop everything for them. Since I am both elderly and a parent, I think it's reasonable to assume you were including me in that assessment." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mom, Jennifer was just venting about her own parents. It wasn't about you. Wasn't it? I asked. Then why did Sarah repeat those exact words when she was coordinating with you about how to manage my visit? Why did she say that Jennifer agreed with your strategy of minimizing my presence in your lives? The room fell silent except for the sound of the children playing quietly in the corner, blissfully unaware of the adult drama unfolding around them. Emma and Tyler had brought books and seemed content to let the adults talk, but I could see them glancing up occasionally with the curiosity that children have about grown-up conflicts. We never said we wanted to minimize your presence, Michael said. But his voice lacked conviction. Michael, I said, and there was enough authority in my tone to make him straighten in his chair despite being a successful adult with his own family. I raised you to be honest. Don't insult my intelligence by lying to me now. David, who had been silent up to this point, decided to try a more direct approach. Eleanor, what exactly do you want from us? What would it take to resolve this situation? I looked around the room at these people who shared my DNA but seemed like strangers, and I felt a moment of profound sadness for what we had lost. Then I pushed the sadness aside and focused on what needed to be done. What I want, David, is very simple. I want my children to treat me with the same respect and consideration that they show to people who aren't related to them. I want to be included in family activities instead of being an afterthought to be managed. I want to be valued as a person instead of being seen as an obligation. We do value you, Sarah said, but the words sounded hollow. Do you? I asked. Then explain why you've systematically removed me from family photos. Explain why you forgot I was coming to visit. Explain why my presence here is problematic when your in-laws visit. But their presence isn't problematic when I'm here. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. Actually, don't explain. I'm no longer interested in your explanations or your excuses or your carefully crafted apologies. I'm interested in actions, and your actions have made your feelings very clear. I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked Sarah's perfectly manicured backyard. The landscaping was beautiful and sterile, much like the relationships in this house. So here's what's going to happen, I said, not turning around to face them. I'm going to find a lovely little house somewhere in this area. Close enough to be a constant presence in your lives, but far enough away that you can't control or manage my interactions with other people. I heard sharp intakes of breath from multiple directions. I'm going to establish myself in your community. I'll join clubs, volunteer at local organizations, make friends with your neighbors. I'll become the kind of active, visible community member that elderly people can be when they're not being hidden away by their embarrassed children. Mom, Michael's voice carried a note of panic. You can't just uproot your entire life because of a misunderstanding. I turned to face him, and the expression on my face must have been something to see because he actually shrank back in his chair. Misunderstanding? I repeated. Is that what we're calling it now? Michael, I heard Sarah tell you that she was hoping I would forget about wanting to visit my family. I heard her say that my visits were becoming a burden. I heard her coordinate with you about how to minimize my disruptive presence in your lives. Exactly which part of that was a misunderstanding? Jennifer tried to intervene. Eleanor, families go through difficult periods. It doesn't mean... Jennifer, I said, cutting her off with the kind of sharp authority that had once silenced chattering students. You forfeit the right to give me advice about family relationships when you disparage elderly parents to their own children. The young woman's face went pale, and she looked to Michael for support. But my son was staring at his hands, apparently finding his cuticles fascinating. This is getting out of hand, David said, standing up as if he were going to take charge of the situation. Eleanor, you're clearly upset, and that's understandable. But making threats and ultimatums isn't going to solve anything. I looked at this man who had married my daughter, lived in a house filled with her success, benefited from the values I had instilled in her, and was now treating me like a problem to be managed by committee. Threats? I said mildly. David, I haven't made any threats. I've simply informed you of my decisions about my own life. The fact that those decisions alarm you says more about your priorities than mine. You can't seriously intend to move here permanently just to spite us, Sarah said, and there was real desperation in her voice now. Spite? I repeated, tilting my head slightly. Sarah, I prefer to think of it as finally prioritizing my own happiness the same way you've been prioritizing yours. I walked back to where they were all sitting and looked at each of them in turn. You see, children, you made a crucial error in your calculations. You assumed that because I love you, I would continue to accept whatever treatment you chose to give me. You thought that maternal love meant being endlessly forgiving of disrespect and neglect. Emma looked up from her book with the sudden attention that children give to adult conversations when they sense something important is happening. But love doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, I continued. Love means having enough respect for yourself and the other person to demand better. And I'm finally demanding better. Michael made one last desperate attempt at manipulation. Mom, think about what this will do to the grandchildren. They don't understand what's happening. You're going to confuse and upset them. I looked at Emma and Tyler, both of whom were now openly listening to the conversation with fascination rather than confusion. Actually, I said, I think the children understand perfectly well what's happening. They've been watching their parents treat their grandmother with disrespect and dismissal, and they're learning that this is acceptable behavior toward elderly family members. Emma spoke up suddenly, her young voice cutting through the adult tension. Grandma Eleanor, are you really going to live here in California? I'm considering it, sweetheart, I replied. Would you like that? Yes, she said with the enthusiasm that children reserve for genuinely exciting possibilities. Then we could see you more often, and you could come to my school events, and maybe you could teach me how to make those cookies you brought. The look of horror that crossed Sarah's face at this innocent suggestion was almost comical. The idea of her mother becoming a regular presence at school events, potentially meeting and charming her daughter's teachers and classmates' parents, was clearly her worst nightmare. Tyler joined the conversation with the directness that 9-year-olds possess. Mom, why don't you want Grandma to live here? She's nice, and she tells good stories. Sarah struggled to find an appropriate response to her son's question that wouldn't make her sound like exactly what she was. A woman who found her own mother's presence inconvenient. It's not that I don't want Grandma here, she said weakly. It's just that she has her own life in Boston, and her friends, and her doctors. But Grandma said she wants to live here, Tyler pointed out with ruthless logic. And she's a grown-up, so she can decide where she wants to live, right? Out of the mouths of babes. These children, with their clear understanding of autonomy and choice, were exposing the paternalistic assumptions that their parents had been making about their grandmother's right to make her own decisions. Of course Grandma can decide where she wants to live, Michael said, shooting a warning look at his nephew to prevent further uncomfortable questions. We just want to make sure she's thought it through carefully. I've thought it through very carefully indeed, I said. In fact, I've already made some preliminary arrangements. The adults in the room exchanged glances that clearly said they had been hoping this was all just an emotional outburst that would blow over. What kind of arrangements? David asked, and his lawyer instincts were clearly on high alert. Well, I've spoken with my financial advisor about liquidating some assets to fund a house purchase here. I've contacted my physician about transferring my medical records to a California practice. I've researched senior communities in this area that might be suitable for someone who wants to remain active and engaged. Sarah's face had gone completely white. Mom, you can't make major financial decisions when you're emotional. That's not responsible. Emotional? I repeated. Sarah, I'm not emotional. I'm strategic. There's a significant difference. I walked to the coffee table where Sarah had left her legal pads and picked up one of her pens. You see, I spent 40 years managing teenagers who thought they were smarter than me. I learned to stay 3 steps ahead of manipulative behavior, to anticipate arguments before they were made, and to implement consequences that actually changed behavior rather than just providing temporary punishment. I began writing on one of her legal pads, my handwriting still clear and precise despite my age. So I've developed a comprehensive plan for my relocation that takes into account all the objections you might raise and all the obstacles you might try to create. What kind of plan? Jennifer asked, and her voice was very quiet. I looked up from my writing and smiled at her with the kind of expression that had once made difficult students reconsider their choices. The kind of plan that ensures I get exactly what I want while making it very difficult for you to interfere, I said pleasantly. I tore the sheet of paper from the legal pad and handed it to Sarah. These are the real estate agents I'll be contacting this week. I've done my research, and these are the people who specialize in helping seniors find appropriate housing in desirable neighborhoods. Sarah stared at the list as if it were a death warrant. I've also compiled a list of community organizations that I plan to join, I continued, taking another sheet of paper from my purse. The Historical Society, the Garden Club, the volunteer reading program at the local library, and the senior advocacy group that works with the city council on issues affecting elderly residents. Michael was beginning to look genuinely panicked. Mom, you're talking about completely changing your life because of one difficult weekend. One difficult weekend? I repeated. Michael, this isn't about one weekend. This is about years of being marginalized, dismissed, and treated like an inconvenience by the people I love most. This weekend simply opened my eyes to how systematic that treatment has been. I sat back down and looked at each of them with the kind of steady gaze that had once made misbehaving students confess their transgressions. You wanted me to stop being a burden on your busy lives. Congratulations, you're about to get exactly what you asked for. I'm going to stop expecting anything from you. I'm going to stop adjusting my schedule to accommodate your convenience. I'm going to stop being the accommodating, understanding mother who accepts whatever scraps of attention you choose to throw my way. But you'll still be our mother, Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that might have been genuine emotion. Of course I will, I replied, but I'll be a mother who has her own life, her own friends, her own activities, and her own priorities. A mother who doesn't need to depend on her children for social interaction or emotional fulfillment. I stood up and smoothed my skirt, a gesture that felt like closing a chapter. A mother who has learned that the best way to be valued is to stop making yourself available to people who don't appreciate your presence. The silence that followed was broken by Emma's voice, bright with curiosity. Grandma, if you live here, will you come to my dance recital next month? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I saw the adults exchange glances of barely concealed panic. Sarah had probably been hoping to manage my interactions with the children, to control when and how I saw my grandchildren, to maintain the careful distance that made my presence convenient, rather than disruptive. I would love to come to your dance recital, sweetheart, I said, and Emma's face lit up with genuine joy. And Tyler, I continued, turning to my grandson, didn't you mention that your soccer team is in the playoffs? I'd very much like to see you play. Really? Tyler's excitement was infectious. None of my friends' grandparents come to games. They all say they're too busy or too old. Too old. I looked at this child who saw his grandmother's presence as a gift rather than a burden, and I felt something settle into place inside me that had been unsettled for far too long. Well, I said, I may be old, but I'm not too old to cheer for my grandson's soccer team. The look of horror on Sarah's face at the prospect of her mother becoming a regular presence at her children's activities was worth every moment of hurt and disappointment I had endured over the past years. She was clearly imagining me chatting with other parents, sharing stories about my grandchildren, becoming an integral part of their school community in ways she couldn't control or manage. Mom, Michael said, making one final attempt at negotiation, what if we worked out a better schedule for visits? What if we made more effort to stay in touch between visits? Would that change your mind about moving here? I looked at my son, this successful man who was finally offering what I had been asking for all along, but only because he was panicked about the consequences of his previous behavior. Michael, I said gently, if you had wanted to make more effort to stay in touch with me, you could have done that at any time over the past several years. If you had wanted to prioritize spending time with me, you could have done that before I overheard you discussing how to minimize my presence in your lives. I picked up my purse and checked my watch with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had places to be. The time for promises and negotiations has passed. You've shown me exactly how you feel about having me in your lives, and I've decided to respect that by creating a life that doesn't depend on your attention or approval. I walked toward the door, then turned back for one final observation. You know what's ironic about this situation? You were so worried about me being a burden that you forgot I might have other options. You were so focused on managing me that you never considered what would happen if I stopped being manageable. David made one last desperate attempt at control. Eleanor, if you're serious about this, we should involve lawyers. There are legal considerations, financial implications. David, I interrupted, and my voice carried the authority of someone who had made her decision and wouldn't be swayed by threats or intimidation. I am involving lawyers, my own lawyers, who represent my interests, not yours. I opened the front door and paused on the threshold. I'll be staying at the Marriott downtown while I look for a house. The children are welcome to visit me there, though I understand if their parents are too busy to drive them. Grandma, Emma called out, running to the door. Can we call you tonight? Of course, sweetheart, I said, giving her a hug that felt more genuine than any interaction I'd had with the adults. I'd love to hear about your day. As I walked toward the taxi I had called while they were all busy panicking, I heard the chaos erupting behind me. Sarah's voice raised in what sounded like genuine distress, Michael's attempts at damage control, David's legal consultations, and through it all, the children's excited chatter about their grandmother's new adventure. 3 weeks later, I signed the papers on a charming little house, just 6 blocks from Sarah's mansion. It had a small garden that I could manage, a perfect view of the elementary school where my grandchildren attended classes, and most importantly, it was close enough to their world that I could be a constant, visible reminder of the consequences of taking family for granted. The moving truck from Boston arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I noticed several of Sarah's neighbors watching with curiosity as my furniture and boxes were unloaded. By evening, I had received 3 welcome visits from women who introduced themselves as members of the local garden club and historical society, both organizations I had researched during my hotel stay. Sarah appeared at my door that evening, looking haggard and defeated. Are you happy now? She asked without preamble. I considered the question seriously. Was I happy? I was living in a new city, far from the friends and routines I had known for decades. I was starting over at an age when most people were settled in their patterns. I had blown up my relationship with my children in spectacular fashion. But as I looked at Sarah standing on my doorstep, finally treating me as someone whose decisions mattered enough to argue with, I realized that yes, I was happier than I had been in years. I'm satisfied, I told her. I'm living on my own terms, making my own choices, and demanding the respect I should have been receiving all along. The children miss you, she said, and it sounded like an accusation. Then bring them to visit, I replied. I'm 6 blocks away. It's hardly an inconvenience. That's not the point. Isn't it? I asked. Sarah, for years you've complained about the burden of accommodating my visits. Now I live close enough that you can see me whenever you want, with no advance planning, no disruption to your routine, no inconvenience at all. I would think you'd be delighted. She stared at me as if I had become a stranger, which in many ways I suppose I had. This isn't over, she said finally. No, I agreed. It's just beginning. I'm 85 years old, Sarah. I may have 20 more years to enjoy my new life here. That's 20 years of school events, community activities, holiday celebrations, and family gatherings where I'll be present, whether you like it or not. I smiled at her with the kind of pleasant determination that had once convinced difficult parents to support my classroom management decisions. 20 years to show my grandchildren what it looks like when someone refuses to accept being treated as less than their worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.